Bueno, buenas noches. Es un gusto estar con ustedes una vez más. Me ha pedido Juan que, más cerca, así está mejor. Me ha pedido Juan que dé la conferencia en inglés en atención a los visitantes que hablan ese idioma. So, from this moment on, I'll speak in English. I'm going to present the outline of my most recent book. This is the headline of the book. It's called Neurophilosophy of I, or better still, Neurophilosophy of the I, Self-Consciousness and Personal Identity. It's published by our university, UNAM, and a library in Mexico City. This is the result of a couple of years of thinking and research and writing about self-consciousness. I've been interested in consciousness for a long time now, and recently I've come to the notion, or to the idea, that self-consciousness is one of the key problems of the whole issue of consciousness in general. So this book is a proposal. Essentially, the proposal is that to begin with, what we call, or what has been called in psychology, in philosophy and so on, the I, the first pronoun, the first person pronoun, is not an essence. It's not a spirit inside of a body or a soul in the machine, but it is a system, a cognitive system pertaining to self-consciousness. It's a self-reference and self-representation system available to people, probably to many animals in different degrees. It provides sense of identity and continuity to the person, and it's integrated by at least 10 functions. It used to be 8, and then I keep discovering that probably new specific functions intervene in self-consciousness. So this presentation in the book is about these 10 functions. Each one covers one chapter of the book, so I'm going to have to be extremely superficial in reviewing the issue. The 10 functions or facets or aspects of self-consciousness that I think integrate the whole issue is sensibility, corporality, situation, agency, introspection, self-reference, memory, self-memory, alterity, identity, and morality. So I'm going to cover these aspects very briefly. I start with sensibility. I never liked exactly this word, meaning the sense that every living system has of itself. It's like something inherent to the quality of life. Most of the work being done recently on minimal self-consciousness or minimal consciousness pertains to this problem. I trace the origins of this idea to a couple of philosophers, the German Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Maine de Biran in France, both of them contemporary of the French Revolution, almost contemporary in years. And they are the first philosophers of the I in the strict sense. And both of them, even though they never met each other, and they were contemporaries, postulated that the I is not a spirit. It's a system that engenders itself. It has this extraordinary property that is I think, very interesting for a neurobiologist to explore. In the 20th century, another Frenchman, Michel Henry, was a key person to deal with the philosophy of the I. Very much he calls himself a Biranian, an inheritor of Maine de Biran. He distinguishes himself from the classic phenomenology of Heidegger or of Husserl, putting a lot of emphasis on the corporality of the I, not only on the philosophical aspects. So the three of them are mainly forgotten pioneers on the embodied approach of consciousness, which is right now so much in vogue. So there is a fundamental subjectivity in every living organism. Henri talks about the feeling of being alive as an intrinsic, of course, non-propositional property of beings. It's a basic self-consciousness corresponding to a basic property of life itself. Henri uses this sentence, which I find interesting: the immanent sensibility of life. So every living creature, especially the moving living creatures, not the stationary living systems, the mobile living systems, feel themselves in a way that is tacit, spontaneous, and automatic. It's an absolutely basic experience of feeling, and feeling itself, which is a necessary and basic property of self-consciousness. Further on in evolutionary system, one has to start wondering what kind of mechanism provides the basis for this can be called inherent reverberation or intuitive self-detection of living systems. It's a state of self-consciousness which is organic, direct, and quite fundamental or elementary. And there is at least, I review this in the book more or less carefully, there are at least 3 propositions coming from the biological and neurobiological sciences that pertain to this inherent reverberation. One of these is autopoiesis, the term of Varela and Maturana, of the living systems that builds itself. Another one is the homeostatic reflexibility that has to do with feedback systems, especially in the brain. And the third one, which is extremely interesting, is the immunological eye. The Nobel Prize in Immunology in the 1950s, Barrett, has this concept of the immunological eye, how the immunological system detects and discriminates between self and other, between self-tissue, self-substances, and so on. And it's tolerant to the components of the body of the self, and it's intolerant or attacking other biological systems. I'm not saying that the immunological system is the organic base of self-consciousness. What I'm defending is that the whole organism is provided with several self-detecting systems, which probably relate to one another in this sense. The second property is embodiment or corporality, starting from the fact that every organism receives information about itself in proprioception and interoception, both terms coined by Sherrington in the 1920s or even before. This is a primary function for every mobile system, especially of course the ones with a developed encephalon, with a developed brain. And at all times the system is aware or receives information about its position in space, its posture, the state of its viscera, and the presence of the surroundings. So feeling the posture and the movement, feeling the interior workings of the body, feeling pain, perceiving damage, touching itself, retocarse, I don't know the name in English, especially in higher primates and human beings. There's a lot of activity about taking care of one's body and of each other's body. All of this provides many signals for self-awareness. So altogether, these capacities integrate a dynamic representation of higher level that in humans is recognized as body image, a term that is loosely treated in several ways, but necessarily it's constructed through the integration of all of these more basic properties. Haptic perception is fundamental, and many philosophers of embodiment have treated this recently in a very interesting way. The fact that touch is not only receiving information through the touching systems, it's also receiving information about itself, about the body that touches. And so in this way, the homunculus in the somatosensory system provides a sense of the body by acting and touching by themselves. Of course, the notion of mirror, which has been so widely treated in especially psychoanalytic literature and so on, and the reflection to have a body or to be embodied is a term that has been widely treated in recent publications. The next step is situation. The body is always in an environmental circumstance, and the organism, the self-conscious organism, has to detect where and how and when it is in relation to the environment. So there is an immediate, direct relationship of any moving creature of whatever development course it has with its immediate environment, and sometimes not even immediate, but quite far away. And the discrimination or differentiation, which is tacit between body and environment, is essential for the construction of self-consciousness. It's of course pre-verbal. It's something given to every moving creature. So situation is extremely important. Make a distinction between being ser y estar, which is hard to translate into other languages. I coined half in joking the term. Of course, ontology is the science of being, and ontología, I wouldn't dare put that in English. Ontología is a term cantinflesco, ontoi, no? The notion that has been treated very formally and very profoundly by Heidegger in this concept of Dasein, translated into Spanish usually as ser en el mundo, but I think more appropriately translated as estar en el mundo. And this is also something practically given to people. The environment, the immediate environment, is assimilated and incorporated literally to self-consciousness. So this relation with its environmental, immediate environmental and ecological environment, social and physical, is indispensable to integrate what is called point of view for once, and to integrate also what is called presence. The fact that living beings are always present in the present moment in their environment, and this is given to systems by themselves. This drawing is quite well known. I mean, some of you may have come. It's a drawing made by Ernest Mach, the father of philosophy of science, actually, and it's what he sees with his left eye, lying on his couch. You can see his right hand drawing what we are seeing, and this is the eyebrow, the nose, and of course he sees the rest of his body and some of the environment. Mach was very interested in this subjective, inherent point of view about situation. So another category of studies about this is called the personal space, especially by anthropologists, and and self-territory. One considers the space immediate around the body as part of the self. And voice is very interesting. You know? I'm now talking aloud, and my voice is reaching you through space, and by this way, myself is like present in the space, and is present in the listeners of the voice. This is not only for in the classic concept of logos in the Greek tradition, but is also present in ethology, in animal communication, and so on. So the brain is not this. In this concept, the brain is not this organ locked inside of the skull, but it's a participant brain. It's the organ that makes possible the relationship between the self or self-consciousness and the rest of the world. Here I put a very pioneer work by Spanish-Mexican philosopher Eduardo Nicol, whom I had the opportunity to be close to. It's called Psychology of Vital Situations. This was done in 1941, 42. He was one of the refugees from the Spanish Civil War. He had a tradition of phenomenology and continental philosophy. The fourth point is agency. This autonomous mobility of living beings that is expressed in a behavior that has certain direction, and the direction is provided by the mechanisms selected by the creature itself. So this we know that the frontal lobe is fundamental in these functions that lately are being treated as executive functions of the brain. Not only the frontal lobe intervenes, but it's a crucial part of it. That's why especially these zones, premotor zones, prefrontal cortex and ventrolateral cortex are become active almost in every task that is provided by recent images of the brain. So another point which is very interesting is guided attention, deliberate attention, not automatic attention driven by the stimulus, but the so-called attention directed by the cognitive system or by the self. And another one is the acquisition of skills, how the system is capable of learning skills and movements as a tacit knowledge. All of this is part of the sense of agency. The biological evolution provided the differentiation and liberation, growing liberation of the creatures, and it attains its most advantageous expression in the capacity of directing behavior based on the functions of so-called will. And I review especially the taking of decisions and deliberate action. Almost in the opposite end of this spectrum of agency is introspection, which is the fifth component of self-consciousness. The group of functions which are recursive and reflexive of self-monitoring, which are available to observe, inspect, correct, and judge our own mental processes and our own actions. This is a very old, it's been treated since the Oraculus of Delphos in 6th century before Christ. The factor most characteristic is the control and the direction of attention. So in all of this effort, I'm trying to get rid of notions which are not organic or embodied in this system. So attention to our own mental processes is the essence of introspection, or also attention to our own acts and especially to the immediate effects of our acts on the world. So introspection also here, as in every other function, is not only something self-directed, let's say from the outside to the inside. It's a function that comes in and goes out. The portrait is of Paul Valéry, that has one of the most insightful sentences that I recall. He said, "These thoughts that I write are not the thoughts that I think," which is an extremely introspective thought. I review there the concept of epoche, Husserlian concept of in phenomenology, let's say separating my beliefs and so on about the observations that I make. It's a technique, actually a self-technique. Francisco Varela tries to resurrect some of the epoche approach in his neurophenomenology in 99. And also the attention control during meditation processes, which is has a certain very interesting intertwines with phenomenology's epoche. Other parts of introspection are metacognition, and it's highly recommended the book of Joël Proust, the French cognitive scientist, The Philosophy of Metacognition, Mental Agency and Self-Awareness, and also the possibility of taking some brain images of people that are engaged in tasks of introspection. And in most of them, the medial parts of the brain, especially the precuneus and dorsal parts of the brain and so on, become very active. They become active in many other ways, in many other instances. It's not like a certain part of the brain is in command of introspection, but let's say many of the tasks that require introspection recruit these areas as part of their task. The sixth part is self-reference, the role of the personal pronouns, me, I, which permit a speaker conceptuate and talk about its body, its mind, its history, its existence as identities and possessions. There's a very interesting book called simply Possession. It's not about exorcism. It's in the school of Piaget, and the idea that my thoughts belong to me, my body belongs to me, and so on, are quite interesting in this sense. People distinguish, especially Jean-Paul Sartre in his initial book, he made a very clear distinction between the I pronoun and the I substantive, the I subjective and the I objective, he says. That's why the title of my book should be in the sense of the substantive. It's not I, the subjective I by itself, but the I. When I speak mi yo in Spanish, my I use another approach. And Sartre made a whole case of saying that philosophically the subjective I was unapproachable, and the objective I, he called it, the substantive I, was treatable. Language in first person constitutes a self-referential resource and of self-reflection, which is the key of thinking, of speaking, of writing, and of the dialogue. That it's the mode of expression of subjectivity in language. So children learn to speak and to incorporate the notions of I, me, and mine, and there has been quite a few along development research concerning this property. Another approach that is very interesting comes from the literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin. The notion that there is not a single I, even in the discourse, but a multiplicity of I's that come into play in different forms of thinking, of self-reference, and so on. Bakhtin has a book on the writings of, for example, the brothers Karamazov, and he demonstrates in a very interesting way how there is not a single I in any of the characters of this novel. And from there, he derives this cognitive notion. He doesn't conceptuate it this way, but it's a cognitive notion of the multiplicity of I's, in the way that the human thought is like a dialogue between different I's. And this is a theme that is becoming quite extensive today. I think one key author in this dialogic thinking system is the Polish author Małgorzata Puszalska-Wasil. She has even empirical ways of trying to prove or trying to show how the different I's work each other out. The Spanish psychiatrist Castilla del Pino has quite his speech of entrance into the La Real Academia Española was about self-reflection, and he proposes a whole system of conceptualizing this category. 7. The 7th system is, of course, memory. A fundamental part of self-consciousness is our episodic memory. I don't think that only episodic memory, but also semantic memory forms part of oneself. Not as much, perhaps, as personal memories, but the memories of the things that we know become part of ourselves in a certain way. These capacities of storing and of recovering information are fundamental to conform personal identity. The lived experiences that linger in our memory are an intrinsic part of our self-consciousness. Even Borges used to say that we are our memory. I think it's an exaggeration. There is much more to self-consciousness than self-memory, but certainly it's an intrinsic part. Autobiography is one very interesting way of exploring in this modern approach, multidisciplinary approach of cognitive science. Self-reference and self-autobiographies are a source of quite interesting information. There are here self-portraits, 4 self-portraits of Rembrandt of how many he did, 35 or 40 this sense of individuality or preservation of oneself, despite the enormous change in appearance and certainly in composition of the body, is one very interesting point that some, especially French authors like Ricoeur, have treated extensively. This is the self-portrait of Artemisia Gentileschi. It's very interesting because she is painting herself from a very different point than Rembrandt. Rembrandt is always looking at himself, looking at the mirror, no? Essentially. And Artemisia is not looking at herself. She is portraying herself from outside point of view, like she's painting, and there's no self-reflection in this sense, which is very interesting. Apparently, I'm not a great believer of essential difference between males and females in art, but it's well, some people have considered this a very special self-portrait because precisely she's not looking at herself in a mirror. 8. Alterity. By contrast and by differentiation with everybody else, alterity is the set of capacities that define both personal identity and the identity of others. Especially the school of Ricoeur in France and several other authors have emphasized very much that there wouldn't be a higher identity of ourselves without first or simultaneously recognize the identity of others. So this part is also extremely important. Theory of mind in animals and so on become part of this development. So this set of social functions include the possibility to assign and attribute to others the properties that for introspection we know in ourselves. So these systems like feed each other up, no, one and the other. The importance in neurobiology of mirror neurons, discovered by Giacomo Risolati some 20 years ago, are quite important. They have been, I think, overrated in a certain sense. Not that they are not important, they are extremely important. For a neurobiologist like myself, they demonstrated for the first time, as I recall, that one single neuron can be motor and sensitive at the same time. Usually, in classic neurobiology, we separate motor and sensitive neurons as completely different kinds of neurons. So the fact that a single neuron can be motor, so it discharges when one is making a movement, and it can be sensitive when one sees the same movement executed by others, means that the same neuron can be sensitive and motor at the same time. So this is, and they are probably part of a larger system, the mirror neuron system that Risolati has reviewed lately very widely. It's not only in the frontal lobe, but in the parietal lobe and so on. This network is part of probably what becomes expressed as otherness or alterity. So the properties of attribution, alterity, link and empathy, and with each other, and the interdependence of the self-consciousness include or constitute something that I call in general hetero-consciousness as a complementary. The ninth system is identity. It's extremely extensive. I recognize this self-portrait is by Chávez Morado or Camarena. Juan, gracias. It's extraordinary because he is painting himself in a mirror and in different ways. Talks about the multiplicity of the I and so on. So the concept of oneself flourishes in the collective of others by identification and by contrast. One identifies oneself in identification with some characteristics and in contrast with others. So that this identity, extensive identity, I would say, is developed during the development of, especially during adolescence, and education in terms of rules, costumes, social requirements, and so on. The cognitive and affective systems of self-representation affect social life intrinsically, and they are affected by themselves, by the role that people carry out in their shared environment. In the book, I recognize at least these nine types of identity: personality, proper name, first name, role, sex, race, ethnia or ethnics, social class, labor, and creed. This is only, as you can see, to mention something that can grow extensively, especially from neurobiology. It's very interesting that each one of these identities has a neurobiological correlate or fundament, and also a social fundament that are intrinsically corresponding one another. And the last one is morality. Traditionally, the word conscious in Spanish, consciousness in Spanish, la palabra conciencia en español, has a moral sense, in difference than in English. In English, you distinguish between conscious and consciousness. the moral part and the, let's say, cognitive part of consciousness. In Spanish, for all from 9th century, we have found some references in books of in the early books of Spanish language. Conscious is always conciencia, is always moral. It's a knowledge that is defined as intuitive and practical about justice and honesty of the actions, both own or self and others. Curiously, you can find arguments like this in height that was mentioned in the last symposium. In older books, there's this Latin name, scintilla conscientia, which is the spark of consciousness. Saint Jerome and other fathers of the church use this. In 1611, for example, in one classic text, it says, what is consciousness? Well, not consciousness in English, conciencia in Spanish, is science of oneself, or certainty, or almost absolute certainty of that lingers in our soul, being that good or bad. This moral notion is very important. It's very interesting that in Spanish we don't distinguish between conciencia moral y conciencia cognitiva, whether in English and in German, apparently so. So moral consciousness refers to the criteria, values and emotions that allow a person to evaluate and judge if their own actions are correct or not in terms of their essence and consequence. So the ethical posture implies a search, both theoretical and practical, to find a better way of living in company. So these notions of morality are not religious anymore, are part of the cognitive system of self-consciousness. These capacities and processes conform moral consciousness and ethics, ethicity. Some authors use the word ethicity for that. How are these functions organized? Just a few words about this. My idea is something like this. In this Venn diagram of 10 functions or 10 facets are like the functions are intersecting. Sometimes one uses or exerts one specifically, but usually they need to be together in order to operate. And if this would be like a model of the self-consciousness system of these 10 functions, each one of them is like a cone that has a very profound and long development, both in phylogeny and ontogeny. It has a long evolutionary and developmental, so that my idea of theory of the flock of birds as a function of the brain that unites and binds together several different functions is a form of understanding how self-consciousness emerges and arises from all of these different functions, which are very elementary and very old in evolution and in development. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias por su presentación, doctor Díaz. Bueno, vamos a empezar con las preguntas.
Thank you very much, José Luis. That was very interesting. I'm wondering about what you want to explain, and whether in your characterization of the function, it seems to me that you are assuming self-conscious. So in the self-consciousness. So some notion in the characterization of the function.
Sure. I'm assuming self-consciousness as such.
Yeah. So we cannot. It seems to me that we cannot characterize properly characterize self-reference, pre-reflective self-consciousness, or alterity, or the sense of having a body from the inside. In order to characterize these functions that you are appealing to, a proper characterization thereof assumes already self-consciousness.
Sure.
And then I'm a little bit confused whether we can have a characterization thereof. So you see the question. So
Yeah, I see the question. Not only me, but this is probably it's a self-paradox that was clearly stated by Fichte and by Maine de Viran in the turning of the 18th to 19th centuries. I don't think that is solvable in the strict sense. One has to. Same happens with consciousness, but self-consciousness being reflective as it is. In order to postulate, as you mentioned, self-consciousness, one has to assume that it's a function that exists by itself or engenders itself. I think that the labor in that case of neurobiology would be to provide at least candidates from the biological and neurobiological point of view of how can that happen in self-governing systems and so on. I don't think the core point that you're making can be solvable by itself.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. I have a question that is a kind of puzzle that arises for any view that establishes a constitutive link between the I and embodiment. I agree with this kind of view. And then the question is, how do we explain that in so many cultures, it is so tempting to think of the I as not embodied, like a soul, a spirit, and so on. And the question is whether you have a view of why this illusion is so pervasive.
What can I do with that question? It has lingered with me for a long time. My first response to that, which I don't like, but is the one that I dislike least, is that that I is a projection of the own cognitive system, a projection and not an embodiment. And it's the opposite of embodiment. It's the spiritualization of a faculty that becomes cosified.
Reified.
No, cosificación in español. Cosificación. It becomes like concrete in a sense that most people today believe in traditional cultures and in our culture altogether. The notion of soul, no? The notion of spirit, and that being the essence of oneself. I think that is sustained also by certain altered states of consciousness that happen to people. For example, seeing oneself from the outside. That happens in near-death experiences, for example, in some psychedelic experiences also. When one has an experience as strong as that, usually it's very powerful, one tends to consider that it's realistic.
I see.
I don't, but I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I was wondering about the metaphysics of these 10 properties that you said for the I.
Yes.
So basically, if you think they are necessary, sufficient, likely to be, statistically, is a cluster. I mean, how many of those do you think we need in order to have the I? And related question is, when we think of the plural I, one would think those are necessary but not sufficient.
Yes.
There must be something else.
Yes.
But already in some of those properties already there was an idea of another person. So what are the metaphysics of the relationship between the I and those 10 properties, and what else do you think it's needed maybe for the plural I?
Yes. The last picture that I showed, the last slide that I showed, attempts to tackle this question. And I'm not, again, completely satisfied with it. I have this Venn diagram of 10 functions intersecting one another, more or less at the same level and in the same way. I don't think that's true. I think it's much more complex than that. It's a good initial approach. And when you say which ones of those are constituent, necessary and sufficient constituents of self-consciousness, that is even more complicated, because I am defending in all of this approach that self-consciousness is not only a human capacity. There's self-consciousness in probably all along the evolution of systems, but each one of them is extremely different from one another. So if you ask me about human self-consciousness, perhaps that would be a way to approach a little better. I would say that most of them are necessary but not sufficient. For example, neuropathology and neurology can provide some very interesting avenues of search in this. Some patients with lesions in the brain lose some of these capacities but not others. How can we establish if they are still self-conscious or not? No? For example, Alzheimer patients eventually lose all of their episodic memory, personal episodic memories. One would say that they are not self-conscious anymore. They are self-conscious in other senses. They relate to their environment. They are able to sometimes even perform certain skills that they have learned. So I think there's a lot to learn from neurology in these cases. And we are not going to come with an easy answer of this is necessary and this is sufficient and so on. I am afraid that it's going to take me some time to search into this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Sure.
Interestingly, it's very interesting. On the one hand, you mentioned certain functions that are deeply connected with the so-called post-cognitivist tradition, such as the post-cognitivist tradition, such as, for example, the autopoietic approach or the enactive or the sensory motor approach.
Yes.
But on the other hand, when you presented the idea of embodiment, you pointed out that there are certain features that require high-level dynamic representation.
Yes.
So you talked about a body image or some sort of high-level representation.
Yes.
And, well, this is a very important discussion in contemporary philosophy of mind and also in contemporary phenomenology. Yes. I'm thinking about people like Frédéric de Vigneland.
Sure.
She distinguishes between the body schema and the body image, and she thinks that the body image is deeply connected with the sense of ownership, basic sense of ownership. So something that is really interesting is to combine, to have a sort of hybrid model. So my question is very direct, that do we need representations after all?
I think we do, but I think we have to adapt the concept heavily, modify the concept heavily. I never found myself completely in the field of embodiment versus representation. I think representation is a concept that has to be actualized, has to be modified in order to include embodiment. Finally, body image is a representation of one's body, but it's not something that happens there at the end of the sensory systems and so on. It's something that is embodied, that has to be inactive and so on, and that is representative. I think the whole key to me in this representation debate is to make representation sufficiently wide as to accept the body and the situation and so on. I think there are many instances of cognition that are representative as such, and one cannot get rid of them. But one has to incorporate, literally in both senses of the word, incorporate the embodiment trend, in cognitive science. So I'm still a representationalist and I'm an embodimentalist. So I am with you. We need a hybrid model, and I think it's on the way. It's on the make. I don't see anything that has been clearly, convincingly stated in respect.
Thank you very much.
Voy a hacer en español porque no la tengo muy claro lo que quiero preguntar, pero es sobre la mirada. ¿Qué papel juega la mirada de los otros en la conformación de mi yo? Y esto cómo se representa, mi campo de trabajo es la historia del arte, cómo se representa en los autorretratos de los pintores, la mirada.
Bueno, me referí, I referred, can I respond in English? I referred briefly to the self-portraits of Rembrandt and of Artemisia Gentileschi. There are many others. And I think there is a whole field there of what is called recently neuroaesthetics that has cognitive implications. I think that would be the work of somebody like you, like a historian of art, working along with a cognitive scientist or something, to actually penetrate into the self-portraits of many artists in many cultures, and seeing, for example, this distinction that some people make about self-portraits being directed towards the viewer, like Rembrandt's, all of the Rembrandts are looking at you. That means they are looking at the mirror. And Artemisia Gentileschi is not looking at the mirror, and others. So I think there's a whole cognitive field of search in this. I'm not able to say much more about it now.
Thank you, José Luis. Thank you very much for this panoramic view on I. I have a little question and a big question.
Oh, okay.
The little question is, why did you leave out language and culture out of this panoramic view? I understand you want to apply that to small creatures. I don't know how far down the road, but leaving out language and culture seems to me strange. You know, when you talk about the I, or perhaps you didn't leave him, but you put him somewhere else. The big question is.
Can I answer the little one first? Language is there. It's the fifth property is self-reference, which is a linguistic property of referring to oneself. The being masterful in the use of I, me, and mine is the linguistic property of self-consciousness in language. That to begin with. Many creatures that don't have speech, I think, have self-reference, but it's a non-verbal self-reference. José Luis Bermúdez has a big treatment of these things. So language is included here. That's the small question. What is the big one?
The big question is that when you start with sensitivity, the number one function,
yes,
is function 0, right? Is no I, no consciousness. So how do we start with the number one function, sensitivity? I mean, I guess that's a recasting of the hard problem, right, of consciousness. But I always wondered, you know, when you think of evolution, and if we go back probably 4,000 million years ago, when life just started, then how did ever sensitivity come out? How did it come out? Do you have any idea of, was it a miracle? Was it a leap, like a quantum leap, or how did it come about?
I think that question is curious, but it comes and goes in the history of science in the last century, 150 years. It is the essence of the discussion between vitalists and mechanicists in the 1920s. Vitalists thought that there was something else from outside or working along biology that provided systems with the main characteristics of life. And the main characteristic of life that I can think of is precisely this: the fact that it has agency, that it has sensitivity, and so on. That question was more or less resolved by the appearance of in the 1950s of general system theory, information theory, and cybernetics. I think to me that's the great scientific revolution of the 20th century. It was really a switch in paradigm from linear, concrete into open systems and so on. So the question was more or less resolved by Bertalanffy, saying that these properties pertaining to life itself were emergent properties of the whole system. Today I know these are terms that are old-fashioned, that don't, one immediately asks your question, no? But exactly how? Emergence is a nice word, but how does it work precisely? No? How does self-consciousness emerge in evolution and so on? Well, come on. Sure, that is the bottom line. Well, neither you nor I will be able to answer that.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for the talk and for making it in English.
Sure.
So I will not leave you. I will not let you go before I will go on a little bit with Juan's question.
Okay.
But I will try to rephrase it. My question is, what is the domain where all these functions, as you call them, can be found? Do you see what I mean? And perhaps to rephrase this, what do you mean by function? Are these properties? If these are properties of what? Are these properties of experience?
No.
Or behavior?
No.
Or matter? Or
living matter. Living matter. To me, it has been extremely enlightening to discover a philosopher that I didn't know nothing about until a year ago, Michel Henry, the Frenchman. It's very interesting to get into him. Have you heard of Michel Henry? Well, it's he makes the case of phenomenology based on life. Life itself is the where it happens.
so you can see them. I mean, so if there are properties of matter, that means that they are in the third person of the life matter. Okay, some sort of matter. You can observe it from the third person. You don't need to do the reflection, like phenomenological reflection or what you called introspection. But Claire told us before that perhaps this is not the best possible terminology. But they can be studied. Let's call this in quotation marks objectively. So I because I can think of many of these 10 that can be only known by the subjects,
sure.
by the experiencing subjects.
Yes.
Yes. So how can then there be a property of matter?
Because I would say some properties of living matter can only be felt from within. Okay. Do you like that? No, not much.
Yeah, I think we make this many times. I like this is the history of psychology.
Yes.
But it's not quite clear what is the domain it is studying. Is it behavior? Is it experience? Is it something in between? Is it just systems that are somewhere in abstract? And I'm also still not completely sure. So you can. So what you are saying actually is you have to be flexible. Sometimes you go inside, sometimes you can see this from outside, sometimes it's immersed in the matter and can be modeled, let's say, by computer, sometimes no, sometimes you need to be a perceiver to know it and so on. So
I guess I would subscribe to that flexibility, but also not to the extreme, because if you go to the extreme, you lose ground. It's hard to locate or to put boundaries on exactly what we're talking about. To me, again, reading Henry, to me was very enlightening about living matter. living matter is a very special property of matter, and part of that property is that it feels itself, and that feeling itself is not so subjective as it sounds, because one of the main messages of this effort that I made is to make all of these properties both subjective and objective. It can be felt from within, it can be sometimes observed to a certain degree, more or less, from the outside in the third person. So this distinction between subjective and objective, which Merleau-Ponty tried to erase, I think it's the way to go.
Thank you.
I know. I see doubt in your face, there's doubt there.
Hay tiempo también para otras preguntas. Si alguien quiere hacer otra.
Hi.
Hola, hola.
I would like to make my classical reduction. There are neural.
Espérame,
sorry.
no se estaba oyendo bien, perdón.
No.
Ahí está mejor.
Okay. I would like to ask reductionist question about if there are neural correlates related to the self. I think is related to the default mode network.
Sure.
And the second is related to certain pathologies such as schizophrenia or psychopathology, that it could be like in an other dimension of the self, because they don't accomplish these prerequisites of order or morality. And it concept
Te oigo sin el micrófono.
This concept should place these people like they are in the inner. And the third question is the use of psilocybin in the study, in the experimental study of these self processes.
Well, three big questions. Concerning the first, I like the way that the word that you used, correlation. I am a neurobiologist by training, so I am a strong believer that every mental act has a correlate in the brain or in the body. And the word correlate, it's good because it's not reductionist. I think the mistake here would be to say that self-consciousness resides in a certain module in the brain. I don't think that has been, in most of the studies that have, and I review them in the book, I didn't have time in this presentation, which is very general, but in each one of these functions, I review the foundations, the neural foundations of each one of them. And it's very curious, in most of these functions, the available information on brain imaging involves the activity of the medial cortex of the frontal lobe, the medial parietal lobe, and so it looks like this both left and right medial cortices are essential in the formation of self-consciousness, essential in the sense that they are necessary to be there in order to experience self-consciousness. And there's very interesting neuroanatomical comparisons between the thickness of this cortex between humans and primates and so on. Curiously, humans have wider medial frontal cortex than any other primate. And those are interesting things. Of course, I'm not trying to minimize them, but they are not the answer to the big question. They are part of the landscape that one has to put together. That's concerning the first. Concerning the second, yes, my next project, which is already developing, has to do with the multiplicity of eyes, and one of the of the paradigm cases of this is mental illness, particularly schizophrenia and personality disorders and so on. There's a lot made by classic psychiatrists in this. Carl Jaspers has an incredible chapter in his Psychopathology of 1913 concerning the psychiatric alterations of the eye that one has to come back to. And about psilocybin and about hallucinogens, yes, one of the effects, classical effects, is despersonalization. And there's a lot to learn from that, how that happens and so on. Is it a brain system that gets disengaged and so on? I don't think that at this point, I cannot make an answer. Maybe some other people that work more concretely on hallucinogens would be able to say more. But certainly it's another tool to use in this inquest.
Bueno, creo que es momento de cerrar. Doctor, muchísimas gracias por compartir con nosotros.